Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 452. I'm the host Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. We have quite a bit to talk about on today's show. Before we get into the news, just want to remind everyone that we are in the middle of our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute. We've already raised quite a good chunk of money, but we are looking for a little bit more support to help us get over the finish line. So if everybody could head on over to the Institute and make a donation, we would really appreciate it. Of course, the Institute was founded by the great Scott Horton and has published all four of his books and will be publishing his fifth book on the war in Ukraine, hopefully at the end of the year. But Connor, every time we talk to Scott, you get a different answer on when he's hoping to have it done. But we have both read advanced copies and drafts of what Scott is working on, and it is special. So everybody, donating to the Institute is helping to fund Scott continuing to work on that book, and also all the other great stuff the Institute is doing, in the meantime as well. So articles every day, me and Connor are writing in the news section, putting out episodes of podcasts, The Scott Horton Show, Don't Tread on Anyone, Vital Descent, Year Zero, this show, tons of great podcast content from the Institute. Other books, Lori Calhoun just released Questioning the COVID Company Line last week, and then op-ed articles every day. So tons of great stuff at the Institute. Please check us out. Please give us some support. And with that, Connor, let's get into today's show. And I am going to let you start off on today's show, giving us some news that this headline was shocking to me, Connor. FBI unapproves snooping on U.S. lawmakers, fuels debate over surveillance powers. Connor, what's going on here?
Yeah, so and of course, these revelations come as there's this big debate in Congress about renewing Section 702, specifically because it has been used to conduct warrantless spying on American citizens. So I wrote this one for antiwar.com on July 22nd. So a newly declassified court document has revealed the FBI improperly searched a surveillance database seeking information about a U.S. senator, a state senator, and a state judge. The disclosure comes during this heated congressional debate over intelligence agencies' abilities to conduct warrantless spying on American citizens and their communications. Released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on, this would have been last Friday, the revelations were included in an order by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court issued in April. The document shows that in June of 2022, an FBI analyst conducted unapproved searches for information on a U.S. senator as well as a state senator using a database created by Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. Section 702 authorizes a tool used by U.S. spy agencies to conduct warrantless surveillance on foreign targets and any Americans with whom they may be interacting. Now, the expiration date on the law is coming up in December, as growing animosity over the spy bureaucracy's abuse of power continues to prompt resistance, particularly from GOP lawmakers. Now, senior FBI official told Politico that the anonymous FBI analyst who was not authorized to conduct searches using, quote, sensitive query terms, including the names of people running for office or the names of public officials. Additionally, the report said that the searches did not meet the threshold of being, quote, reasonably likely to retrieve evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. It was claimed that the analyst had evidence that these officials were being targeted by a foreign spy service. However, the aforementioned FBI official, speaking to Politico, said that if the analyst had sought the required pre-approval for the queries, they would not have been approved. Now, last October, the FBI ran another search using a state judge's social security number. According to the FISA court document, the judge had, quote, complained to the FBI about alleged civil rights violations perpetuated by a municipal chief of police. The names of the affected lawmakers have not been disclosed, and it remains unclear if the American senator is still in office, with the Bureau only acknowledging that he was, in fact, a sitting senator as of last summer. And congressional leaders have warned the White House that Section 702 will not be renewed absent significant changes. For instance, such reforms would prohibit federal agents from obtaining phone, email, and other electronic communications records of Americans interfacing with targeted foreign individuals. The White House is busy attempting to sway Republican members by spinning the renewal of Section 702 as imperative to counter threats overseas from Russia, but especially China. Now, although the New York Times reported earlier this month, Republicans in the opposition camp will probably not be receptive. The conservatives have, quote, seized on official determinations that federal agents botched a wiretap on a Trump campaign advisor, and more recent disclosures that FBI analysts improperly used Section 702 to search for information about hundreds of Americans who came under scrutiny in connection with the January 6th protests and the Black Lives Matter protests after the 2020 murder of George Floyd by a police officer. Now, Representative Matt Gaetz, a Republican from Florida, declared you couldn't waterboard me into reauthorizing Section 702, going on to cite instances of federal spy powers being used to infringe on the rights of political dissidents on both the left and the right. He said these 702 authorities were abused against people in Washington on January 6th, and they were abused against people who were affiliated with the BLM movement, and I'm equally aggrieved by both of these things. Now, in 2018, the program's reauthorization received Gaetz's support, sort of highlighting the shift in the Republican Party. But despite ostensible reforms in the past, the 2018 renewal only enhanced the ability of the intelligence agencies to subject Americans to their massive surveillance system. According to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the bill that was most recently passed, S-139, this is from 2018, endorses nearly all warrantless searches of databases containing Americans' communications collected under Section 702. It allows for the restarting of about collection, an invasive type of surveillance that the NSA ended in 2017 after being criticized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court for privacy violations. So, this will hopefully bolster that debate because it just, as much as they continue to go, well, it's really important that we have this to defend ourselves from the Chinese and the Russians and these terrorists overseas. That's what we're using it for. More and more evidence just continues to come out that it's being used to spy on Americans, which we already knew. But it's, especially when you're talking about snooping on American lawmakers, that is only going to further inflame the resistance to the renewal among, Democrats, but especially these Republicans who are, especially after Russiagate, they've been, very burned by this national security state and all of its, there's these huge investigations into the politicization of these spy agencies. And so this is certainly not going to help the Biden administration, even as they're trying to spin it as like a real something that the China hawks can get behind. Okay. So now this next piece I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, and this is a study that was published by Princeton University and UC University of Colorado Boulder. So this is a study. The Trinity nuclear test fallout impacted 46 states, as well as Canada and Mexico. So I wrote this on the 25th. A recently released study exposes the widespread dispersion of radioactive fallout and devastation caused by the U.S. government's first detonation of a nuclear weapon. The Trinity atomic bomb test, which caused environmental contamination and population exposures, was carried out in New Mexico on July 16, 1945. This new research shows within 10 days of the explosion, which saw a mushroom cloud as high as 50,000 to 70,000 feet, and radioactive deposits dispersed across 46 states, as well as Canada and Mexico. Now, the study covers the Trinity test as well as dozens more of these above-ground atmospheric nuclear tests conducted as a result of the Manhattan Project. But not included in the study are the myriad underground nuclear weapons tests. Between 1951 and 1998, Washington blew up more than 800 subterranean nuclear weapons. Utilizing a combination of data previously unavailable during past studies, the researchers used, quote, high-resolution reanalyzed historical weather fields, U.S. government data, and complex atmospheric modeling to try to chart the distribution of radioactive fallout in the days following historical nuclear tests. This is from a report out of Gizmodo. Now, the study was led by Sebastian Philippe, a scientist and researcher from Princeton University's program on science and global security. The study reads, our results show the significant contribution of the Trinity fallout to the total deposition density across the contiguous U.S. and in New Mexico in particular. Now, during the time period analyzed by these researchers, there were 101 nuclear tests conducted. Since Trinity, there were subsequently 93 more atmospheric tests in Nevada, which saw nuclear fallout distributed across the country yet again by these radioactive mushroom clouds. Now, the U.S. government also launched 45 airburst tests, which saw nuclear bombs tipped on rockets detonated within the Earth's upper atmosphere. 40,000 people lived within 50 miles of Trinity's blast. Many of the victims and their relatives have been affected with various cancers ever since. Washington has never compensated these Americans. There's an activist group called the Tuscaloosa Bays and Downwinders Consortium, which has been working hard to try and get the word out. There's a great piece by Connor Eccles at Responsible Statecraft about that, which was run on antiwar.com earlier this week. And it's just devastating. I mean, you hear these testimonials from these people who lived near the blast site, and then for the rest of their lives, you have their cousins and their great grandfathers and their sons all dying of cancer. And of course, they've never been compensated for it. One of the things that's discussed is because of how far-reaching the effects of the nuclear fallout from all these tests in this era are. Behind the scenes, lawmakers will privately admit that the reason they can't compensate, people outside of, Nevada, let's say, who live near the Los Alamos laboratory, is because it would just be there's so much money involved because so many people have gotten cancer or have been horribly affected by these tests. So it's a huge can of worms, but this is absolutely reprehensible that these people, because there's even, as Connor shows in his piece, there are people who have blown their whole life savings on trying to just stay alive when they're dying of cancer and leaving their families with virtually nothing. And it's of course the U.S. government owes these people a lot, and so. As Connor explains in his article, so when the initial shock wore off, locals returned to their daily lives. They drank from cisterns full of radioactive debris, ate beef from cattle that had been grazing on the radioactive dust for weeks on end, and breathed air full of tiny plutonium particles. Only later would the real impact become clear. The test site was chosen by, of course, Robert Oppenheimer. Now, as a result of the Trinity test, infant mortality in New Mexico between 1944 and 1945 increased by 56%. Locals, including those who saw the explosion themselves, were flat out lied to by U.S. officials with a cover story that this was all just an accident which occurred at a nearby ammunition depot. It's important that this test is coming out now, especially with the Christopher Nolan film Oppenheimer and our great colleague Patrick McFarlane's new documentary, which is far more informative, The Truth About Robert Oppenheimer. It's important that this story comes out to show, because this was completely ignored. In fact, the people from that group I just mentioned, the Tuscaloosa Bays and Downwinders Consortium, they attempted to get this part of the story into the movie. They published an op-ed when the film crew was down there shooting the movie in New Mexico, and they were completely ignored. She tried to get in, the woman who leads this group attempted to get in touch with I forget what she wrote the book that the movie is based on, American Prometheus or something like this, and was completely rebuffed. She was working on the movie too, I believe. But so this part of the story is completely left out, and they go ahead with this myth that, there was nothing in the area 40 miles in any direction, and it's just not true. And it's also important because of course, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has said that we have never been closer to nuclear war, given the tensions and the unwillingness, particularly of the American side, to engage in any sort of diplomacy in the midst of this bloody proxy war with Russia right on their border in Ukraine. And so it's very timely to see, because, it's very easy if you just pay attention to mainstream news and listen to our politicians and so-called representatives to forget the true dangers of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And of course, we also have these rising tensions with China, building up toward brinksmanship with this massive military buildup in their neighborhood, and also these drastically upgraded ties with Taiwan, raising tensions in the Asia Pacific. And Kyle will give us an update on China and the escalations there recently.
All right, Connor, the first article I have here is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. China hits back at Japan over comments on aiding Taiwan. The Chinese Foreign Ministry on Tuesday hit back at Japan over comments made by a Japanese official about Tokyo possibly assisting Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. Japan's Foreign Minister of State for Defense made the comments in an interview with The Telegraph that was published on Sunday. He said that countries around the world support Taiwan like the US and its allies are backing Ukraine, then it would be very possible that we would be able to provide some kind of support for Taiwan. And so, Connor, it's pretty understandable why China would be upset about, any kind of comments of turning Taiwan into Ukraine. Seeing how that has played out and, been a huge bloody and travesty in Europe. So he obviously doesn't want that brought to an area that he considers China. So that was the first article here. Next article, Beijing vows countermeasured after CIA says it's rebuilding spy networks in China. Connor, there's been some really interesting reporting by James Bamford, basically explaining how for years and years the U.S. intelligence agencies didn't do a very good job of protecting their assets, particularly when it came to China. And so they had really lost a lot of their network of spies in China. And so my guess is that's why William Byrne is making these comments. But at the Aspen Security Forum, he said, "We've made progress and we're working very hard over recent years to ensure that we have strong human intelligence capability to complement what we acquire through other methods." And I guess in a way, Connor, this, I'm sure China and the US always assume that they're trying to do this, right? Like we're constantly trying to develop new and different, in sources in China, flip different people in China. And I assume that the Chinese are trying to do that in America as well. And as well as Russia and probably Israel and maybe even France and the UK. Like all these larger countries probably carry out these kind of operations. And so it shouldn't be a surprise. But of course, coming out and publicly saying that, China's going to be asked for a response. And so this is what China's response is. And then the last article here is probably the most provocative and the most disturbing, Connor. U.S. tests cargo plane missile system in the Pacific in a message to China. The U.S. Air Force has tested a new missile system in the Pacific that could give cargo planes the ability to launch long-range cruise missiles that are normally fired from large bombers. The system is known as the Rapid Dragon, and it allows C-130 and C-17 cargo planes to drop missiles contained in a pallet with a parachute. That the Rapid Dragon was tested by the U.S. near Norway last year, which the U.S. military officially described as an intentional provocation aimed at Russia. The latest test of Rapid Dragon was aimed at China as it conducted during the Mobility Garden 2023 drills, which was held across the Indo-Pacific. Although it's not clear where in the region the missile was launched, the large-scale exercises involved detachments from Australia, Canada, France, Japan, the UK, and New Zealand. And so, of course, Connor, this is, these kind of operations make it so that anywhere the U.S. has these kind of planes deployed, which are typically cargo planes and maybe not thought of as threatening, it becomes potentially something that could drop a bomb, a pretty large bomb. So this is a pretty major escalation and serious. And now I'm going to hand it back over to you to talk about some Middle East news.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an article I wrote on July 20th for the Institute. This is all about this article that Tom Friedman wrote after Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president's visit to Washington and his meeting in the Oval Office with Biden. So this is called "Biden Expresses Concern Over Netanyahu's Judicial Overhaul, Warns of Risk to the Special Relationship." So President Joe Biden has admonished Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to cease his attempts to ram through his coalition's controversial controversial judicial overhaul amid mass opposition protests. He recommends instead that the Israeli leaders seek a broad consensus. Following a meeting with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, Biden told New York Times columnist Tom Friedman that if a more, quote, democratic path is not taken, Washington's special relationship with Tel Aviv could be affected. Now, while still facing a corruption trial since coming to power last December, Netanyahu's coalition made up of Likud, far-right, and ultra-Orthodox parties has attempted to give the Knesset the power to override Israeli Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority vote. The plan also calls for de facto control regarding court nominees. And for months, as Friedman explains, much of the citizenry has joined large and disruptive mass protests, as this plan has sparked concerns that the overhaul will neuter the Supreme Court, seizing its ability to check the Knesset's power. And Friedman also notes that Israel does not have a constitution. Business leaders have called for more protests, demonstrators have obstructed public transportation by blocking roads, and military reservists have been warning they will not volunteer for duties if this legislation process persists. Biden expressed to Friedman his support for the protests, saying it shows the vibrancy of Israel's democracy, which must remain the core of our bilateral relationship. He continued explaining, finding consensus on controversial areas of policy means taking the time you need for significant changes. That's essential. So my recommendation to Israeli leaders is not to rush. I believe the best outcome is to continue to seek the broadest possible consensus here. Friedman goes on to clarify, saying Biden is basically pleading with Netanyahu and his supporters to understand if we are not seen to share that democratic value, it will be difficult to sustain the special relationship that Israel and America have enjoyed for the last 75 years for another 75 years. Now, Israel is an apartheid state, as several in-depth reports published in recent years by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the top Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, and the United Nations have made clear. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the blockaded Gaza Strip have been occupied or under Israeli military control since 1967. Since Netanyahu resumed his role as prime minister, Tel Aviv has also launched drone strikes inside Iran, bombed Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, and Lebanon. Israeli forces and settlers have killed nearly, at this point, it's more than 200 Palestinians this year. Washington funds the Israeli military with billions of dollars in aid every year, even though this is technically illegal because of Tel Aviv's open secret nuclear weapons arsenal. Now, all of Israel's aggressions, attacks, and mass murders this year have been endorsed by the White House. Biden himself has been known for decades as Israel's man in Washington and declared his nation's ties with Tel Aviv were, quote, bone deep last year following an Israeli army sniper shooting an American journalist in the face while she was wearing a press vest. Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in the West Bank while covering an IDF raid against the Jenin refugee camp. And since January, the current Israeli government has approved record levels of construction and settlements within the West Bank, endorsing 12,855 housing units. In a statement, Israeli anti-settlement watchdog Peace Now said, during the past 6 months, the only sector that Israel has vigorously promoted is the settlement enterprise. Jewish-only colonies or settlements which continue to be built inside these territories, militarily occupied for almost 60 years, are illegal per international law. So this article, created quite a bit of controversy because, well, first of all, Friedman said some things that are just outrageous on their face, like, I'm pleading, Biden's pleading with the Israelis because he could be the last pro-Israel president of the United States. And, of course, there was this, I believe, it was a resolution put forward that was saying that that Israel is not a racist or apartheid state, which is just completely ridiculous. And there were only, I believe, 9. It was mostly members of the Squad and the Progressive Caucus that voted against this. And you had Nikki Haley going, "We're taking names, and we're going to remember this come the next election." And, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's, very good on so many things, current presidential candidate, has been running around accusing American lawmakers of being anti-Semites and lying about Israel being an apartheid state. And so it's become this very kind of even more of a hot button issue than it ordinarily is. And there's, the hype is really, I think, even as Robert F. Kennedy put out on Twitter that oh my, this is Biden interfering in the internal affairs of nations again. He's calling into question our special relationship with Israel, where we give them $3.8 billion a year to continue bombing the open air concentration camp, the Gaza Strip, and taking people's homes in the West Bank and killing civilians. And so it was just, it's ridiculous to see this put out that there was any kind of a concern that there would be a change in policy. If anything, this just gave all the usual suspects an opportunity to double down and really once again display their subservience and fealty to the Israeli government. And that is what has happened. And so later on, as Dave DeCamp reports here, on July 25th, the State Department wanted to make extra clear that the U.S. will not cut military aid for Israel after this judicial overhaul vote. So, as Dave writes here, while the Biden administration has expressed concern about the judicial overhaul being pushed forward by the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it has made clear that U.S. military aid to Israel will not be affected. So State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel said Tuesday, there is not going to be any cut or stoppage of military aid, and that is because our commitment to Israel and our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. Our decades-long partnership with Israel is ironclad. Now, Patel's comments come a day after the Israeli Knesset voted to abolish Israel's, quote, reasonableness standard, eliminating the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions that it deems unreasonable. The law passed amid massive demonstrations against the plan in a vote of 64 to 0, as the opposition did not vote in protest. Patel said it is clear that the legislation has consequences for people's day-to-day lives, and that is why we said that such changes in democracy require a broad consensus. Last week, President Biden signaled the judicial overhaul could impact the, quote, special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. But after the vote, the administration was quick to assure Israel that it had full military support from the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, no less. He spoke with his Israeli counterpart Yoav Gallant by phone on Tuesday. According to the Pentagon's readout of the call, Secretary Austin made clear that the U.S. commitment to Israel's security is steadfast and unwavering, and affirmed that the Department of Defense is focused on initiatives that deepen military cooperation. And concerning the judicial overhaul, Austin, quote, underscored the United States' belief that broad consensus through political dialogue, especially in the coming weeks and months, are critical elements of resilient democracy. The Pentagon said that Austin also urged Minister Gallant to address extremist settler violence against Palestinian civilians and continue the Israeli Ministry of Defense's efforts to improve economic opportunities for Palestinians in the West Bank. The Netanyahu government's recent bombing campaign in Gaza and massive raids in the West Bank have also not impacted U.S. military aid, as the U.S. has supported the operations. And Dave just reiterates here that over 200 Palestinians have been killed this year, mostly in the West Bank, but many in Gaza, and then also some people have been killed in East Jerusalem as well this year. And of course, Netanyahu is just, he's doubled. The Yoav Gallant came out and proclaimed, I believe in May, that we've doubled the airstrikes in Syria since Netanyahu came back to power. And there were these massive drills at the beginning of the year where the U.S. was training with with Israel, practicing for war with Iran. And then later on, Netanyahu's been holding tons of military drills this year. We've covered previously that they really were rehearsing a multi-front war where they were preparing to fight, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Iranians and the Syrians. And we actually had Michael Kurilla, the head of CENTCOM, General Kurilla, participate in these drills. And so, for all this hype about deepening military cooperation and what Austin is saying, this is talking about, we even know from the Discord leaks that the CIA is not actually sure if Netanyahu is just blowing smoke as usual, or if he really does intend to launch an overt military attack against Iran, which would start a massive war that would dwarf, Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course drag us in immediately. And so, the last thing we need is this deepening military cooperation that Austin is talking about. And of course, they don't really care about the Palestinians, and we'll get to that more in a moment. So this new piece I wrote today for the Institute, New York Times, Biden ramps up efforts to forge Saudi-Israeli normalization. So we're back trying to get a sort of Abraham Accords style deal with the Saudis. And Tom Friedman has written this new article in the Times that came out yesterday, and it's all about this other part of the conversation that he had with Biden last week. And he's euphoric, would be the way to put it in the article, about the possibility of this of Biden making this deal happen. So, as I write here, the Joe Biden administration is redoubling its efforts in pursuit of a normalization deal between Tel Aviv and Riyadh, says New York Times columnist Tom Friedman. Significantly curtailing China's influence in the Middle East is one of the White House's main priorities here. According to Friedman, based on his discussion with Biden last week, the White House is taking yet another stab at a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia and Israel, even if it means potentially offering Riyadh, quote, NATO-level security guarantees and other major commitments. And for decades, as I say, Biden has been known as Israel's man in Washington, although the Palestinians stand to gain little from rapprochement between the Gulf Kingdom and the Jewish state. Now, so according to Friedman, the president is wrestling with whether to pursue the possibility of a U.S.-Saudi mutual security pact that would involve Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel, provided that Israel make concessions to the Palestinians that would preserve the possibility of a two-state solution. So I just run through here again that Israel is an apartheid state, and they've had this brutal military occupation for 60 years over millions of Palestinian Muslims and Christians, systematically depriving people of their land, their rights, their property, and quite often their lives. Friedman says the administration expects the Saudis will demand that Tel Aviv, quote, preserve the prospect of a two-state solution. Now, that is unlikely, even as the Times writer himself reluctantly acknowledges, particularly given that Netanyahu's cabinet and coalition are made up of extremist settlers, Jewish supremacists, and ultra-nationalists determined to annex the West Bank by force. And the current government is setting records for settlement expansion, building additional Jewish-only colonies in the occupied territories, which only serve to further eviscerate even the pretense of a future Palestinian state. Now, in May, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman told the Arab League that, quote, the Palestinian issue was and remains the central issue for Arab countries, and it is at the top of the kingdom's priorities. The deal hyped by Friedman may simply be out of reach, as the kingdom has already refused to normalize with the Israelis unless there is a two-state solution. Nonetheless, normalization was reportedly discussed this week between Biden, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Brett McGurk, the White House's top Middle East official on the National Security Council. Following these meetings, Biden dispatched Sullivan and McGurk to Saudi Arabia, where they arrived Thursday morning, so yesterday morning, according to Friedman. The officials are there to explore possibilities regarding, quote, some kind of U.S., Saudi, Israeli, Palestinian understanding. Sullivan and McGurk are said to be probing MBS for what he seeks in exchange for a deal with Israel. Per the Times, the Saudis hope for a, quote, NATO-level mutual security treaty from the U.S. and assistance building a civilian nuclear energy program, which would be monitored by the United States, and increased access to advanced weapon systems such as the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense THAAD missile defense platform. Friedman says Saudi Arabia wants these additional weapons as well as the security guarantee to counter threats from Iran. But there is a reason to believe that Riyadh is now less concerned about a confrontation with Tehran than it was previously. In a groundbreaking diplomatic coup, Beijing brokered a normalization deal between the Islamic Republic and the Saudi Kingdom earlier this year. The longtime arch rivals have resumed full diplomatic relations and plan to expand cooperation, particularly with respect to trade and investment, while both sides have expressed interest in creating a naval alliance. In another move that, quote, blindsided the U.S., Saudi Arabia has also restored relations with Iran's key ally, Damascus. And that blindsided line is a reference to CIA Director William Burns' visit to Riyadh in April, where he told MBS that we've been blindsided by essentially Saudi's independent foreign policy streak. Now, Biden would like the Saudis to end the fighting in Yemen, says Friedman. However, for well over a year, there have been no Saudi airstrikes on its neighbor nor retaliatory cross border attacks by the Houthis. Riyadh and the Houthis are now eager to make a final deal to lift the Saudi blockade, which has suffocated Yemen for years, and formally end a war that has killed hundreds of thousands, according to the UN. Now, even as the Saudi led coalition employed plainly genocidal tactics throughout its years long war on Yemen, the region's poorest country, Washington provided vital military, intelligence, logistical, and maintenance support, along with reliable diplomatic cover needed to continue the bombing campaign. Now, there is evidence that the White House has deliberately aimed to stall peace negotiations between the Houthis and the Saudis, eyeing a resumption of fighting. Biden has been unwilling to apply Washington's considerable leverage with Riyadh to seal the deal with the Houthis. For instance, by renouncing further U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition, whether fighting resumes or not. A security guarantee would not make a continuation of the war less likely. The Biden administration is seeking various concessions from Saudi Arabia regarding its relationship with Beijing. As Freeman lays out here, including no longer doing business with Chinese tech giants like Huawei, whose latest telecommunications equipment is banned in the United States, along with assurances that Riyadh will continue settling oil sales using the U.S. dollar only. As Friedman put it, Washington was not amused by reports last year that Saudi Arabia was considering accepting Chinese renminbi to price some oil sales to China instead of the U.S. dollar, adding that would have to be canceled. The White House is also attempting to pressure the Israelis into limiting their economic ties with China, their third largest trading partner after the U.S. and the European Union. And of course, this comes in the as Biden has escalated Washington's economic war with Beijing, including by imposing harsh sanctions and attempting to cripple the Chinese semiconductor industry. Concurrently, the administration is expanding the Pentagon's vast military buildup in the Asia Pacific, preparing for a future war between the world's two largest economies. Okay, so now we're going to move over to Iran. So the U.S. is sending more Marines and more warships to the Middle East over Iran tensions. And this is from Dave DeCamp on July 23rd. So U.S. Central Command announced on July 20th that the U.S. was deploying a Marine Corps unit and additional warships to the Middle East amid heightened tensions with Iran. The command said in a press release that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the deployment of an amphibious readiness group maritime expeditionary unit, which typically consists of about 2,200 Marines and 3 amphibious warships. CENTCOM said that the deployment was ordered in response to, quote, recent attempts by Iran to seize commercial ships. Iran seized 2 vessels in the Persian Gulf after the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in the region in April. Now, since then, the U.S. has announced it was conducting more patrols and sending more military assets to the Middle East, including fighter jets and a guided missile destroyer. The U.S. seized the ship, the Suez Rashan, under the pretext of sanctions enforcement and is trying to steal its cargo. But the vessel is currently sitting off the coast of Texas, as American companies are hesitant to take the oil as they fear retaliation from Iran in the Persian Gulf. The U.S. has a history of seizing tankers and stealing Iranian cargo. In 2021, the Biden administration sold off 2 million barrels of Iranian oil taken from a tanker that was seized off the coast of the UAE. And during the Trump administration, the U.S. seized ships carrying Iranian gas bound for Venezuela and discharged some of the cargo in New York. CENTCOM claimed that in the past 2 years, Iran has attacked, seized, or attempted seizure of nearly 20 internationally flagged merchant vessels in the CENTCOM area of operations. It's also, speaking of, Iran is building leverage here. It's interesting that the American companies are realizing that it's hopefully they'll start to pressure Washington to stop doing this, to stop seizing Iranian oil tankers. And of course, there's also a piece that came out in early 2021 in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how between 2019 and the first few months of 2021, Israel had attacked, I believe, more than a dozen Iranian oil tankers, which were trying to transfer oil to Syria. Because, of course, the U.S. occupies about a third of Syria, stealing most of their oil and their wheat resources. They're being crushed under the sanctions as well. And that's a big part of this next story we're going to be talking about. But, so, I mean, it's interesting that the the Iranians have actually, it seems like this could actually solve the problem, at least to some extent, because it doesn't really make, I mean, unless the Americans just want to seize the oil and then not be able to sell it, this might set a precedent for maybe some sort of a relaxed policy with regards to these ship seizures. However, we have to we'll catch up next week and see what's going on, because we know we were looking into these interim deal negotiations where Iran would be able to export apparently a million barrels of oil per day, and they were going to receive some limited sanctions relief in the form of unfrozen assets that are held in South Korea, Iraq, and the IMF. I think $20 billion worth of assets. But that interim deal was being negotiated reportedly by Robert Malley with the UN, with Iran's UN ambassador on American soil. But Robert Malley has been relieved of his post as the special envoy for Iran over accusations that he mishandled classified information. And now we have hawks in the, congressional leaders like Michael McCaul, who's a huge Iran hawk, is a huge hawk on pretty much everything. But he's really, demanding answers and trying to, really investigate Robert Malley. And it's pretty blatant that it almost certainly has something to do with this deal that was being negotiated behind the scenes with the Iranians. So we'll have to see what happens next on the front with this limited, but certainly better than what the status quo diplomacy with Tehran. Okay, so the last story I have is U.S. sanctions block UN earthquake rescue system in Syria. And this is from Dave DeCamp again at antiwar.com on July 26th. A life-saving United Nations mapping system to coordinate rescue efforts was blocked in Syria by U.S. sanctions following a devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey on February 6th. This is from a Middle East Eye report on Wednesday. The system, known as the INSARAG Coordination and Management System, uses a cloud-based mapping platform to help rescuers log details of their efforts and share other information. The mapping platform the ICMS uses is called ArcGIS, which is provided by a California-based company, the Environmental Systems Research Institute. Now, according to the ESRI's website, the technology is prohibited in Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, and Belarus due to U.S. sanctions. It's also blocked in Crimea and the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine. So rescuers could not use the ICMS they could use it, in neighboring Turkey, but the service, was blocked in Syria during the critical first days of rescue operations. Now, even though the U.S. issued a 180-day sanctions exemption for, quote, all transactions related to earthquake relief efforts on February 9th, it's unclear from the Middle East Eye report if the ICMS was ever accessible in Syria. Now, U.S. sanctions are also impeding Syrian efforts to rebuild earthquake-damaged cities, as they are specifically designed to prevent Syria's reconstruction after over 10 years of war. Of course, it's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Syria, and Antony Blinken himself, America's top diplomat, said that those sanctions are designed to prevent reconstruction until there is regime change in Damascus. Now, while U.S. sanctions technically have exemptions for humanitarian goods and services, the situation in Syria demonstrates once again how companies typically cut off all services with sanctioned countries because they don't want to risk running afoul of the minefield of American economic penalties and measures. The Middle East Eye report said that the ICMS is inaccessible in Iran, which is a very earthquake-prone country. Like in other nations, U.S. sanctions on Iran have had a devastating impact on the country's civilian population. UN experts said earlier this year that the U.S. and other Western sanctions are causing more deaths of Iranians with thalassemia, a congenital blood disorder that requires specialized medicine. So the UN experts said since the reimposition of sanctions against Iran by the U.S. in 2018, overcompliance with sanctions has escalated, affecting the import of life-saving iron-regulating medicines for Iranian thalassemia patients. This not only violates their right to health, but also results in increased complications and mortality rates. And so I think it's always important to cite there's this the UN rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures or sanctions for the for the UN, excuse me, has gone to both Iran and Syria. And first of all, when she came back from Syria, she said that 90% of their population lives below the poverty line, and they have significantly limited access to water, to food, to fuel, to electricity, to transportation, to healthcare. It's been devastating what the American policy has done to Syria, and with Iran, one of the things that she had pointed out was that in some areas of the country, food insecurity has reached, I believe it was 60%. So, I mean, and it's so shameful that we have, when Matt Gaetz has put forward these resolutions, war powers resolutions, in order to get U.S. troops out of Syria to end the occupation of eastern Syria. There is there is bipartisan support. At least over 100 lawmakers voted for that. Of course, it was voted down by the majority, but that's great to see. Now, when there was another bill that came out that would have lifted the sanctions on Syria, I believe only Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie voted for that. So, of course, there needs to be a great deal more activism highlighting the effects of these economic wars against the people of Syria and Iran as well, as among other countries, Venezuela, North Korea, and we need to because this is just another form of war, and we need to get this message out to people. And the American people ultimately have to do something about this. We can't sit around while we're starving people, while our government is starving people to death.
Right, Connor. I'm going to talk very quickly here before we wrap up about just a couple things that have been going on in Syria that I have been covering. And that is the U.S. is claiming that Russian jets are hitting American drones with flares. Now, I believe I've seen some clarity, and these are parachute flares. And so these are flares, I guess, that come down and linger a little bit longer than just a typical flare. And I don't know if that makes it more or less impressive that the Russian pilots seem to be able to keep hitting the drones with them. There was a report on Saturday or Sunday that this occurred in Syria, and then American officials again claimed it happened on Wednesday. Now, the Russians are saying that the reason that this is occurring is because American drones are locking on, are targeting, or at least activating their targeting systems when they're in the vicinity of the Russian warplanes. And this is causing an automatic defensive response from the Russian warplane platforms. And they also claim that an American drone nearly caused a midair collision with a Russian warplane. So, Connor, this seems to be heating up. The two countries have operated in Syria for a very long time and have used deconfliction protocols and communications. But with the war in Ukraine, it doesn't really seem like there's any communication or very much communication between the two sides. Now, maybe there is still some communication between the militaries in Syria, but judging how often these events are occurring, it doesn't seem that is the case anymore. So this is bad news, Connor. I'm hopeful that somewhere along the lines both sides will realize this can't really escalate too far, and so there has to be a way to unwind it and reestablish some kind of protocols for Syria to avoid these confrontations. But at the same time, with as much that's going on between the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine, it could be that this just ends up being another outlet for the proxy war between the two sides. And we, kind of continue to see direct or indirect confrontations, between the Russian and the American drones just in the skies above Syria versus maybe out in the Black Sea where a Russian drone previously downed, not a Russian warplane previously downed an American drone by jumping some fuel on it. So kind of these, indirect direct confrontations where they're not shooting at each other yet, Connor, but they certainly are interfering with each other, and it does seem to be an attempt to cause some damage or prevent operations from occurring. In the past, I've read that the American drones interfere with the Russians when they're trying to carry out anti-ISIS operations or anti-jihadist operations in Syria, and so if that is occurring, then you would understand why the Russians are getting upset with the American drone presence. Anyways, Connor, that's where we should wrap up the show for today. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows next week, and check out the Libertarian Institute. Make a donation if you can. We appreciate it. Connor, thank you
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
much.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.